communification of communication, the Communification Podcast.
Aloha, Dr. Savage and Dr. Arnold La'anui, Matthew Savage, Dr. Arnold La'anui. I feel like I know you both by first names though. You know, my mother-in-law heard Arnold speak and was like, you have to look into his work. And of course, used to deal with the press, and I'm the press. And Matt, he wasn't a doctor when I met him. We went to college together at UH Manoa. It's so nice to see your face again. But now I guess I will welcome you formally. Welcome Dr. Savage and Dr. La'anui to the show.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes, mahalo. It's so good to see you too, Malika. And you can always call me Matt.
Oh, thank you. Well, today's communication topic is cyberbullying. We'll define that in just a second and get into the research. But first, we'd like to know where your passion comes from. And if you want to mention anything about your area of research or expertise that helps us to understand why you're so interested in this subject, that would be great. So let's start with Dr. Savage.
Cool, thanks, Malika. I did the communication master's program, now communicology, at the University of Hawaii Manoa. And I was taking a health communication course in the last semester before I was heading off to Arizona State. And I just saw the power that we had to be able to persuade people to adopt behavior change to improve communities and health in communities. And at the same time, I was working with Dr. Amy Hubbard, who we both know and love, about some programs helping retention efforts at UH. And all of our findings were speaking to the central role of relational management. And so as I continued all of my work in public health promotion and in cyberbullying research, really focusing on the role of aggression and skills that we'll get into today, I just really saw a place for us as researchers to be able to make a really big practical difference in the lives of adolescents and college students who are going through a tough time when it comes to how communication changes via technology. And unfortunately, sometimes that can be, problematic and tough.
Very, very interesting area of research, I'm sure. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Dr. La'anui, how about you?
Well, I first kind of got interested in this subject maybe about 20 plus years ago. Right around the early 2000s, I was on an FBI SWAT team. I was working violent crimes, and the FBI started putting together cyber squads all around the country. And lo and behold, I found myself on a cyber squad. And I had no background in tech, I was a gamer with a roll of quarters in the 80s and 90s, like everybody else, but I kind of stepped away from the whole tech world and then found myself kind of back in it. And the FBI sent me to great schools. I went to a whole bunch of hacking schools and got really familiar with the technology. And the more I started to investigate violations of federal laws having to do with crimes, the more I started to see and witness our younger adults and our children becoming both victims and offenders at the same time. And just seeing this world as the Wild West and the new frontier, and then all of a sudden, Web 2.0 sets in, and then these smartphones start coming out for the first time, and a whole new array of violations that we had never imagined before. And was, I guess now looking back, kind of privy to be on the ground floor watching. I remember in 2004, when I gave a presentation about online safety to a group of high school kids, and we were hearing feedback of what we now know as sexting. The word didn't exist just yet. And then all of a sudden, over the course of a summer, this whole new phenomenon blows out. And then, of course, as the years progress, cyberbullying becomes a thing. So I had always been really passionate about trying to service that younger generation of individual, because they were touching these technologies, and it's kind of as if you took a set of car keys and you threw them at a teenager and said, here you go, drive, but nobody took a driver's ed course. And so I had always grown very passionate about trying to see if we could service that group of individuals in the hopes that as they mature and become adults, they become more responsible people with these technologies. so that when they're adults, they don't kind of, step into the fray or accidentally do something that, we could have corrected earlier. Seeing a prevention as a little, and through prevention through education as a better means of trying to service that future young citizen.
Oh my gosh, we've got boots on the ground and we've got the academic research. This is going to be riveting. I can already tell. So let's start with the basics. So maybe Matthew, you can define some terms for us. So what is cyberbullying? Maybe define flaming or other terms that are related to cyberbullying, just to help us lay that foundation.
Yeah, so this is something that there wasn't a lot of agreement about back in 2004, but I think people have pretty much come to the consensus that cyberbullying is the deliberate and repeated misuse of communication technology to threaten or harm one another. But like Dr. La'anui said, we often think about this as like an A to B problem, a perpetrator to victim. But the thing is that this gets caught up in interaction and relationships. And you brought up the term sexting, and it's a perfect example of this is how I actually learned a lot about this topic in the beginning. Was around that same time I was asked by the Attorney General's office with my advisor at ASU to help them determine the effectiveness of the trainings that were being done in middle schools about internet safety. And they were doing an awesome job, but it wasn't getting at the relational aspect of it and the fact that when kids break up with one another, they do really mean things. So a term like flaming is used usually when one person to another is going to send like a direct or insulting message. It's usually pretty personal, whereas something like trolling, which I think we're going to talk about later, is a little less personal. Now, the victim would never say it didn't feel personal, but it's going to be usually more in a public space. But there's lots of terms, and the thing is that they're always changing because of what we just mentioned, that this is like the wild west of the internet. So I pulled up a couple that maybe people haven't heard of or people could keep in mind in terms of protecting themselves. So one is doxing, and think of this like documents. So doxing, if we think about all the information we put out there in different places, any one piece of that information might not be too concerning if someone knew about it. But if someone really wanted to cyber stalk you, which is definitely a crime, and I'm sure Dr. La'anui can speak to that, they could put together evidences from these different areas and kind of paint a picture of your behaviors, your financial situation, things that you're doing with your family, et cetera. So it's kind of like someone picking up the breadcrumbs and piecing it together and then sharing that information in a way that you wouldn't want to. I mentioned cyber stalking. That's definitely more serious. This is when things are going to happen. Like usually we use the word cyber stalking when there's a bleeding over of the cyberbullying to something in person, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It just can accompany offline stalking. But this is when there's going to involve things like monitoring or false accusations. There might be threats of physical harm being included in the messages. But then there's lots of other terms. I won't define all of them, but like trickery, masquerading, we mentioned trolling, even dissing is a term. So the interested listener can Google some of these and find out all the mean ways that people can interact with one another. But it's all about being deliberate, it being repeated. And there used to be an emphasis on a power imbalance between the perpetrator and the victim. But in recent years, that power imbalance has gotten less attention as cyberbullying and traditional bullying are thought of as more separate constructs than just an extension of one another.
So interesting. I asked listeners to share their experiences, and I heard things like, my life has been threatened, or someone lied about me online. Someone said, someone pretended to be someone else and communicated with my friends and loved ones to spread rumors. People or bots are trolling me. Someone posted private photos of me. And those were all, of course, shared with me anonymously. There were a lot of different types of experiences. And what was really interesting, because we've been talking about our youth, but all of these experiences came from adults.
Yes. And that's something that I've grown more and more, I've grown a bigger heart for, because when I first started investigating this, I thought of it as an adolescent and high school issue. But as I taught about it in classes like relational communication, conflict management, persuasion, even, the majority of students in that room shared with me stories like the ones that you're probably hearing now. And in most of my studies, me and our old friend, Bobby Tokunaga, have done multiple studies of college students. And usually it's anywhere from 20 to 40% will either report having perpetrated or being perpetrated against.
Wow. So what is the prevalence of cyberbullying when it comes to the research with, different age groups or anything that you think might be of interest and maybe some of the negative impacts that research results are showing?
Yeah, just really quickly, and I want to make sure to give space for Dr. La'anui to add his perspective too. I haven't memorized the exact numbers, but in my middle school studies, usually there's like a positive correlation, meaning as one goes up, the other. So between sixth, seventh, and eighth grade is when cyberbullying tends to get pretty worse. It's kind of like the tipping point is at eighth grade, as far as my own reading and research has shown. And in the beginning of these studies that I was working on with many teammates across the country, we assumed that as students went from this 18 to 19 age range, freshmen in college, and as they continued into their sophomore to senior year, it would decline. But actually, it was staying pretty constant, which is consistent with the stories that you're hearing. And some people do disagree that we shouldn't use the term cyberbullying to describe adult behavior, but it's kind of like workplace bullying. We understand what it means. It's visceral, it has a feeling associated with it. So I think there's actually some strength in using the term because it draws attention to the fact that it's really important to address it.
Absolutely. Dr. La'anui, so anything to add? Maybe you can lead us into the goals and motives of cyberbullying.
Yeah, it's been a while since I sat on a couple of U.S. Department of Justice study groups that were actually looking at some of the phenomenon that was taking place. But one of the interesting stats that I had thrown around for years was that at the last survey I took a look at, about 20% of all high school students had actually taken a nude image of themselves and shared it with somebody else. What a lot of folks didn't realize too was that about 10% of the middle school in closest proximity to that high school had actually engaged in the same behavior.
Wow.
But what was rather interesting was that 40% of that campus had actually seen that image. And it was rather surprising as to how viral these images were being shared. And whenever I shared those stats with the students, one of the issues that we always came across was this confusion about privacy and anonymity, and how public and authentic the internet can be. So we see this conflict between privacy and public, and we see this conflict between authenticity and being real online and being anonymous. And these two tensions kind of fight at each other and tug and pull. Both are virtuous ideas to have about internet and digital citizenship. But unfortunately, especially when we're dealing with younger folks that haven't quite developed fully, and they are developmentally still immature, and they haven't come across the full concept of cause and effect and long-term consequence of events, that's where we kind of tend to run into a lot of issues. We have younger individuals touching what is essentially the world's most powerful communication tool, this thing that's in your pocket, right? They touch these devices and they don't realize the scope and the impact on how incredibly potent these devices can be, how incredibly permanent what they post online can be, and how incredibly public their actions are. They think they're behaving in private, but in actuality, it's a very public, permanent, and potent environment that they're playing in. And that's where we start to see a lot of the issues and difficulty and hurdles confronting these young people.
So interesting. When we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about curriculum that you were developing for kids. And you also talked about the 5 trials of adolescence and
Right.
where this comes from. And I found that so interesting. Could you share with us some of that?
Sure. Well, let's see. Oftentimes when we talk about cyberbullying, and this goes back to my research maybe 12, 15 years ago, there was always a discussion about the power imbalance between certain individuals. But I was always rather curious as to where that power imbalance actually kind of came from. And it turns out when you kind of really dive deep into the research and you keep asking why, one of the really interesting tidbits that kind of evolves when we start talking to evolutionary biologists and reproductive psychologists is this idea that every species in the world starts to want to reproduce by the time they're in adolescence. And in adults, or I should say, take that back, in humans, we start to see the same evolutionary behavior that once you become an adolescent, this sexual need, this sexual drive to reproduce kind of takes place. But before you even get there, there's these 5 stages of adolescence that everybody kind of goes through. First one is this physical change. Your voice starts to change and you start to get weird bumps on your face with acne. You smell a little bit different and you have hair popping out in the parts of your body that never had hair before. And then you go to this next stage from physical to parental, where all of a sudden now you're pulling away from that family circle, from the maternal and paternal circle that has raised you. And then you start moving into the third phase, the social phase. So you go physical to parental to social. And as you're going through all of these gates and these 5 trials of adolescence, there's these hurdles that kind of take place, right? There's some frictions that take place and you're starting to grow and you're starting to develop. And once you got your social circle developed, you then move into this occupational idea. How is it that I'm going to actually take care of myself when I'm mature, when I'm an adult? And then the last phase that we have is the sexual development. Now, in our most cultures, we don't like the idea of teens, even though they're biologically capable of reproducing kids all over themselves. So from an economic standpoint, a lot of societies out there just don't do that. And so as a result, that sexual component, which is the last stage, is removed biologically from what would ordinarily be maybe the first and even second stage of development, right? Your body is capable, but economically, socially, culturally, we push that to the last trial. But that tension, that sexual development tension always exists. And as a result, what we see in all flora, all fauna on the planet is that we see this perpetual struggle that takes place. First thing that every animal out there wants to do is it wants to show off its genetic health. And so what we see in young adults is the showing off of genetic health. And the way we do that with these technologies is through the power of Instagram, right? We go ahead and we take a photo of ourselves as a young teen and we take a straightforward shot of themselves. And what they're doing when they take that photo, especially the classic ab shot, is that they're showing symmetry in their body. They're demonstrating their genetic health because they don't have any deformities, everything's nice and even. And that's how we go ahead and we decide who's pretty and who's not, is based on these concepts of symmetry. And so guys love the ab shot because it shows more symmetry when you get the extra nice little 6-pack, right? Women do something similar, but women, their attractiveness, the research is clear, has a lot to do with the golden ratio of chest, hip, and waist. And women, oftentimes, they don't even realize it. They go ahead and they show off those dimensions by going 3/4 shot to the camera. And, they stand just so, and it gives you a nice, long, curvy silhouette with a nice little tilt of the head to show a little bit of vulnerability there, right? Those are great photos. And a lot of women go ahead and do that. And in fact, if you go ahead and you take a look, a lot of teen girls, especially here in Hawaii, they don't even realize it. They like to show off their genetic health, their golden ratios, and their symmetry when they take the classic bikini shot. And it's oftentimes them looking out at the ocean, right? And it's like, oh, how hakunani, how beautiful the sea is. And they've got these beautiful silhouettes, but they don't realize what what they're actually engaging in is that they're showing off, once again, their genetic health. So that's the first step, right? Is to show that you're genetically capable, willing, and healthy enough to engage in reproductive behavior. The second step, and this is where we see a lot of the bullying kind of coming from, is that like all other reproductive species out there, we're in a competition. We want to deter rivals from our mating space. And so in order to do that, there's several things that we do, right? We go ahead and we show that we're immune from harm. So it's not unusual for young men to go ahead and show images of themselves engaging in parkour or shooting at the firing range. You know, that there's a lot of symbols. Sometimes they're not good symbols either. Vaping, drinking in excess, and these images show up online as ways of transmitting that, hey, poisons don't get me, I'm immune from harm. And they also deter rivals by basically a pecking order that pushes other people out of that space, right? So then we see some friction that kind of takes place there. So a lot of the tensions that we have are kind of revolved around these eternal struggles for motive and the reason people behave. Motive 1 is power, motive 2 is money, and motive 3, the most powerful of all the motives, sex, reproductive environment. And so we start to see these behaviors developing, especially in our teens, that are coming into their own adulthood, coming into their sexuality, going through these 5 trials of adolescence, but nobody's really quite there coaching them as to how to use these technologies to kind of transmit a better signal. So the curricula I developed, and I have been for a number of years now, I've been kind of working on some curricula to build digital citizenship, but actually do it from a standpoint of not only looking at your own cybersecurity and safety and how to be stranger danger aware when you're online, but realistically thinking about how you transmit who you are, who you want to be, and to do that in a healthy way, bearing in mind, again, this idea that the internet is public, that it's permanent, and that it's incredibly potent. You can convert all of those natures to kind of work for your benefit, but there's nobody out there actually teaching that as of yet.
Matt, I'd love to hear a response.
Well, I have 2 questions because I didn't know a lot about this biopsychosocial perspective. And I'm wondering, it makes sense to me intuitively, the developmental stage. And then it also makes a lot of sense to meet these people where they're at in terms of their own development, to do so that the curriculum is salient to them and actually makes sense given the place that they are in their lives. But what's the biopsychosocial explanation for when people are so mean to their ex? Because in my research, I find that it skyrockets with people retaliating against their former relational partners. So I guess I could maybe answer myself and think of power, but I'm just wondering, like, how does that fit into the model that you're using to develop these curricula?
Yeah, that's certainly there is one dimension to it, right? I mean, there are other reciprocal factors that take place. There's not only a developmental component, but even when we take a look at the world of cyberbullying and all bad behaviors that kind of take place online, there are other factors. Developmental is just one of maybe 4 like leading factors that I've kind of explored. One, for example, another one is a generational idea that it's real difficult to have really good coaching of younger people because each generation is different. You know, each generation comes into the technology and speaks of it in the terms that they remember. You know, like when I talk to my kids about grab your telephone, I'm expecting them to call me. And in my mind, I still imagine a wire. In fact, if we had done this from my home office, I have a collection of old telephones just because I missed the rotary dial. You know, I have an old one that I play with just to get that sensation back. But when I talk to my kids about that, when I say telephone, I'm conceiving something different based on the context and the historical time in which I was born and touched technology. When my kids say telephone, they're texting. It's something different. And that next generation, my grandkids, they will have something totally different. We will use the same term, but we will mean different things. In addition to that, there's an environmental element that we often kind of come into conflict with, right? Cognitively, like when we touch these technologies, Like, for example, I'm in a private little office here, but it's not quite really private. I've got a huge glass window just beyond my computer here. Someone out there could actually be seeing or eavesdropping a little bit. If they're close enough to the window, they could hear what I'm saying. But I believe in this space that I'm in a private environment. Kids, when they go home after school and they grab these tools, they think they're in a space that's private, and everything around them, everything in their space. In fact, oftentimes they'll come home at 3 o'clock, they jump in the shower, they run around the house in their underwear, eating pizza rolls after school, plugging in their devices, turning on the PlayStation, and everything around them says that they're in their personal, intimate space. But in actuality, they're once again touching the most powerful communication tool in the world. And so that cognitive disconnect is an issue. And then when there's that social element.
Right.
And that social element you speak of is one that's always kind of in flux and always evolving.
Mm-hmm.
That is based on cultural norms, based on generational norms, based on your school and your campus in where you're at, the neighborhood in which you kind of grew up. And so all of those tensions kind of come into conflict with each other, and they do add some friction. So that's what makes it really difficult to come up with rules and regulations on how to actually regulate, or in some instance criminalize this behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Is because the technology is moving so quick that by the time it gets adopted and moved, and then people develop social behaviors and norming around these tools and technologies, the legislatures just can't keep up. They can't keep up with it. The state of Hawaii, for example, has tried for years to pass a cyberbullying law and never really quite did so. Oftentimes prosecutors rely on harassment statutes in order to, or in some cases, terroristic threatening statutes in order to kind of get their point across. On the federal side, as you mentioned, there is a cyber stalking statute that's out there. Not too difficult to get a violation, but oftentimes it kind of gets hooked up in with other cases as well. Maybe there could be a child pornography case that's attached to it because you got young people trading images with each other and someone makes it public. But all of these issues are reciprocal on each other. The generational conflict, the environmental conflict, the developmental and social conflict, the legal conflict. And so it makes the area very murky, very difficult
it's so
to
murky.
follow.
That is the trouble, because people ask all the time what the recommendations are. And I'm sure we'll get to some of this on an individual level, but it's really difficult to know what an experience is going to be for a parent or a student, or it doesn't have to be a student, it could just be a person. When they report this, when they save the evidence, where they go, what message they're going to receive in response. Because so much of the cyberbullying context is impulsive. And as you just mentioned, it's legally difficult to keep up with that when the technology is always changing.
Right.
So I definitely see your point, and it makes it difficult to create curriculum. So I'm glad that you're doing so.
Trying.
That's all we can do.
Yep.
A lot of my listeners will probably be familiar with this phrase, the affordances of computer-mediated communication. So those are identifiability, that you can be identified online, the persistence, that what happens in this digital space can live on for a long time, and the accessibility, the extent to which you can access information. And I've heard these pop up already several times in our discussion here. So how do all of these affordances, identifiability, persistence, and access, how do they contribute to the issue of cyberbullying?
Well, I'll say something quickly first, and that is one of the most kind of surprising things was that early in this research, there was kind of this underlying assumption that this was like the revenge of the nerds, but it's really not the case that that's what's going on. However, at the same time, the truth of the matter is that internet self-efficacy, so people's ability and confidence in using these communication technologies, unfortunately does make them better cyberbullies. And so I think the implication of that is for all of us to be aware of some of these tricks and tools and guidelines when it comes to simple things like password, but also being aware of what you're posting and being thoughtful about who might see it and the permanence of that information, because it's really hard to scrub the internet.
Yeah, it's near impossible. I mean, trying to pull something off the internet is really near impossible to do. And the reason it is just because of the nature of the networking itself. You know, each node, each station out there that transmits the data, whether you go ahead and you post something on Facebook or on Instagram, or if you're going ahead and sharing an image via Snapchat, each of these images are shared across different nodes that have caches in them, and they hold on to that data for a certain period, a certain amount of time. And with over 9 billion of these nodes existing on the internet, you cannot pull it off. You can make it difficult to find. And oftentimes when I consult with folks about trying to maintain their online reputation, I don't talk necessarily about erasing the bad things. I talk about replacing the bad things. Basically, I consult with individuals and I tell them, hey, we got to come up with a method of shoving all the drama to page 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the Google search and replacing it with good stuff on page 1, 2, 3.
Right.
And then, you know, if that shows up more often than other, that's what folks will go ahead and realize and take as truth. What shows up on the first or second page of your Google search is typically what rules the day about someone's online reputation.
Yeah.
Arnold, this goes in line with your thesis that you did.
Oh yeah, my doctoral work.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, and thanks for raising that up. So when I was at the FBI, realized, of course, that a lot of the prevention and intervention methods we had weren't quite working. Went back to school, picked up a doctorate degree in education, but my research area was in a little niche field that was just developing called digital semiotics.
Okay.
And that field, the world of digital semiotics, talks about how we use digital artifacts and what's in the four walls of these windows we live in. Back in the day, it was the four walls of Facebook, right? And all of the images that lived in the square, but how individuals interpret not only what you look like in the image that you portray as an individual, but everything that lives in this additional space. And it's this additional space that actually transmits a lot about who we are and what we value. And there are these subconscious, subliminal, and oftentimes very direct messages that kind of take place. And so my research back in the day focused a lot on how colleges, in particular selective and elite universities, were using these digital spaces in order to identify and vet potential candidates, as well as to determine who would come in and who would not come in to their institution. And even though, turns out the research I had conducted indicated that even though schools said, no, we don't do that, every institution I went to and interviewed said, hey, yeah, on policy, we don't do that, but let me tell you a situation where and when this all took place. And turns out everybody does it, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's the old argument of fit. It's
right.
Like,
Oh,
they gotta
totally.
have good fit. You mean you want somebody like us?
Yep. That in fact is the title of my dissertation. Digital semiotics and dimensions of student fit. How we all fit, you know. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, right on point. That's exactly it.
Well, Matt, how about you? Maybe you can give us some background when it comes to communication theory and models from some of the research that you've done to better understand cyberbullying via one of those means.
Yeah. So there's not just like one unified theory of cyberbullying, unfortunately. And it's hard to get to those places. Like academics like to keep asking the why so many layers deep that you're so in the minutia, it's hard to go back to the bird's eye view. But one very straightforward model is the skills deficit model. And basically what it says is that we're all going to have disagreements and we're going to have arguments with one another about the quality of ideas that we have. But the challenge is to hold on to your communication skills. And the good thing, and you probably have talked about this before, is that communication is a skill. So one of the fun things about teaching communication as a skill is we are acknowledging we can get better at it. And so the communication skills deficiency model says that when someone's having a hard time being argumentative, when they're when we could disagree about a point and talk about that point separate from us, they're going to rely on being aggressive, unfortunately. And so we kind of used this base model in our educational approaches to teaching people better argumentation skills. It falls right in line with what Dr. La'anui is talking about with being a netizen or having good citizenship skills, because there's going to be disagreements and we have to be able to address them. So we try to take people away from using aggression as the mechanism for dealing with things. And another theory that gets used often in the research is called the general aggression model. And it has multiple stages, and I won't bore you talking through that. But basically, it kind of recognizes some of these things that we've been talking about with adolescence, but that can happen to any of us in times where emotion is high, that we're making immediate appraisals, meaning we're deciding very quickly how to react without considering all of the information. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of impulsive action. So the best thing you can do when you're cyberbullied is to stop and really think through the larger context of what's going on. So these are two things that I draw upon, and yeah, I think we'll probably jump into those at some point, so I'll save the rest.
All right, fabulous. Well, it's that time of the podcast where our experts answer a listener's question. Are you guys ready?
Okay.
Aloha. Thank you so much, Malika, for having me on the podcast. Hi, everyone. My name is Pili Yarusi. So recently, someone wrote some pretty unkind comments on a podcast I was invited to speak on. It made me feel less than. It made me feel all of a sudden not proud of some really amazing work that I did. And this individual twisted my words around to make me feel like I was a liar. No one likes feeling that way, and it's my story. So it has long since been put out of my mind. Thank you, Malika, for helping with that. As soon as this happened, I thought to come to you, and you were able to make me understand that it was something just to be ignored. But on the other side of this, I was actually wondering what the research says about when bystanders come to your rescue, when those people intervene. Is that helpful? Is it safe?
So first off, I'm not sure my advice is backed up by research. Disclaimer.
No, I like your advice.
Okay, good.
But
That's what I do. And most of the time, like if it's a personal jab that hurts my feelings, but doesn't seem threatening in any way, I just ignore it. But Pili is asking that about bystanders. So what should they do in face-to-face bullying situations? I've often heard the advice that you should speak up for others. So does that translate online as a helpful strategy for dealing with cyberbullies as well?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. I do have some not research-based, albeit anecdotal. It's advice that I've given out and I've seen in action and has been very effective.
I'll do the study on it after.
Perfect. The advice I've given out, and it seems to have worked really well, is and I take a lot from the peer mentoring idea that you see kind of like in high schools. Turns out that when there is bullying behavior that takes place, if there is someone, actually not someone, but someone's, if there is a crowd of individuals who belong to that community, and they go ahead and they stand up to the bullying, but they're of the same social peer level, it turns out it's pretty effective. Now, for example, one high school in particular, I can think of young freshmen started cyberbullying someone online very publicly. This individual went to the same high school, higher grade level, not necessarily an equal peer, but slightly more social capital because they're an upperclassman. Basically was quick to say, hey, look, we don't do that on this campus. I know what you're trying to do. We just don't do the bullying stuff here. I'm going to ask that you stop. And then another person came on, and then all different grade levels all said, yeah, we got to like stop this like right here, right now. And it seemed as if the students were able to police the environment themselves. Mm-hmm. And they did so because it's in particular, especially with the upperclassmen, they were worried about the reflection of the school and the value of their high school diploma upon graduation. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to have any of that drama following them when they left. And so there was a little bit of economy there, because they all kind of, there was some give and take, and the community decided to kind of put a value on their space and their environment and what they wanted it to be. But it was the students themselves that policed it, as opposed to somebody outside that restorative circle of restorative justice, you know, rather than a teacher coming in to say no. The students themselves kind of went in and policed it themselves. Every instance I've seen that's taken place, I've seen that behavior to be very, very helpful in developing a nice, safe cyber environment. But again, anecdotal.
No, but I think that that's backed up by the research in general. The only challenge can be when someone unintentionally instigates the behavior by trying to maybe make light of something, or to kind of change a subject so it takes away from the importance of, or the severity of, the act that just happened. But yeah, there's plenty of actual research that corresponds to the general argument that you're making, because when people are entertained, or when bystanders conspire against that victim as well, that makes the situation a whole lot worse. So say bystanders in Peely's experience, you know, they didn't, but agreed with something or said other mean, it would really like light a fire, you know. But people that stand up, you know, maybe for that term like upstander, right? We've called it like being an active or empowered bystander. So if you can report something, you should, because it's probably going to help someone that may not have the skills to be able to do it themselves. But let's be real, all of this stuff happens in interaction. It's not an A to B. That's the power of the internet. It's an A to B to C to D, and everything's interrelated in between. And so bystanders have a lot of power. So I think that if you see this kind of stuff happening, whether it seems impersonal on a message board, to somebody it's really personal. So I think we could all do a better job of kind of standing up for others around us, not us three here, but in the context of our question, you know?
Right.
Well, the way you communicate that support is really important, right? Because as you were saying, if those people are changing the subject or making light of it, but what I tend to see a lot of is I see people piling on.
Yeah.
So someone
They're
cyberbullies, right? And then they come on and they just make it worse. So if you're bullying back, then that probably, there's a spectrum.
Oh, pardon me. Maybe I misunderstood. You're saying if the victim comes back with something mean themselves, or you just mean other people are doing mean things?
Just bystanders, right?
Oh, okay.
So for example, I once had someone say something not so nice about me, and my followers now came back and said really not so nice things about that person because of the affordances of online communication.
Yeah.
They went back, they did research on this dude, and they're like, well, who are you to say blah blah blah, because you are da 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 da. And so, you know, bystanders can communicate and interact when they see a cyberbullying situation in a number of different ways.
Yeah, part of the problem is that when people instigate the situation and then they potentially become bullies themselves, we want to stop all of that. So the main thing to do is stop. And it's really hard from a communication and persuasion perspective to tell someone to not do a behavior. It's actually easier to come up with a pathway of motivation to get people to adopt a behavior than to say, just don't do anything. And you would think that's simple, but it's really not. So yeah, there is concern, and we don't want victims to become bullies themselves because it perpetuates this cyclical negative communication context.
Right.
Well, that sounds like what Dr. La'anui was saying, which is that perhaps the reason these kids at that school acted in that way was because they were taught a strategy to act in that way, and then they enacted it.
Right, exactly. And that's certainly something that's missing, right? This education on, you know, when we're younger, our parents tell us, hey, if somebody's approaching you a certain way, you know, like be on the lookout for danger, and these are cues and signs of what danger kind of looks like, and these are the steps that kind of take place, and how to kind of protect yourself. There is none of that conversation for online behavior, you know. And again, part of it is there's a generational misunderstanding with the technology. You know, we've got to somehow mediate what that conversation kind of looks like, and as Matt was saying earlier, make it salient to a younger student who's touching and approaching the technology in a very different way, as opposed to what we have or what we're familiar with as adults. But in there, though, the same lessons on how to be a good, kind person still exists. You know, and I know, Malika, you and I had talked about the rules of publishing. Right. There are some general rules on very old fashioned rules that every journalist student knows when it comes to journalistic ethics that would apply not only in old print media, but applies online as well. Right. You ask some real simple questions like, hey, is what you're publishing and what you're saying truthful? Two, have you considered whether or not what you're doing online, what you're publishing, because that's what you are when you're putting something online, you're a publisher, right? Have you considered if what you're publishing was going to hurt somebody? And then three, real simple, hey, you know, before you publish, have you gone through an editorial review? Has someone else, a third party, taken a look before you went online and given you some sort of feedback as to what it is that you're putting out there? Have you taken this information and put it out to a responsible adult to review, give you some feedback before you go ahead and post? Problem is, once again, these are rules of the road, but young people just aren't taught these rules when it comes to these technologies. It's far more reactive, far more quick. And in addition, right, absolutely. And when we talk about the public nature, the permanent nature, and the potent, persistent nature of the internet, really the thread that stitches that all together that everybody forgets is the speed. That the internet is just quick. And so the moment you go ahead and you share that, it's instantaneous to somebody else and instantaneously shared. So it's a bonfire that you can just not get ahead of. You don't have a fire line that you can stop this thing from burning. It's just moving really, really fast.
You need to think before you act. So I
You
like
have
that.
to have a plan for stopping when you're not sure exactly what you should do. Don't respond immediately.
Right.
So that's kind of like the content creator side, I suppose. You know, how do you not become a cyberbully? Think first, think about those three things: the editorial review, the authenticity of the message, and if you're harming someone. Dr. Savage, how about some research-based strategies that you've come across, some do's and don'ts that listeners can use to deal with cyberbullying issues? I know there's a cyber pledge.
There is a cyber pledge. I'm really a big fan of like stopbullying.gov. I like the Megan Meyer Foundation. You know, Megan Meyer's mom has done amazing work in light of the tragedy that happened to her daughter. And but some simple things, like if you're cyberbullied, don't respond if you cannot respond, because it stops the whole interaction. If you think of this spiral of conflict, it can't continue the tailspin if you just don't respond. If you can block the person and it's an appropriate thing to do, depending on the relational context, it might be a good idea, because you can probably undo that should you repair the relationship. You should seek social support, right? Just like the caller, they went to their friend. They let them know how they were feeling, because these things have real terrible effects on our psychological well-being. And it's not something that people should deal with on their own. You should tell your parents if you're young. You should tell your parents if you're old. You should tell your friends. Pardon me, you could tell a teacher. And there are ways to report it. But your report, unfortunately, isn't going to go very far if you don't save evidence. So usually the four things are: stop and don't respond, seek some social support so you can deal with the psychological impact, save evidence, and report. And reporting can look like a lot of different things. It kind of depends on the context. If you're a little kid, you're going to tell a teacher. There might be a school policy. If you're an adult, it kind of depends on, did it happen on a website or a social media site? Because there's going to be different rules and reporting mechanisms. Maybe Dr. La'anui can talk a little bit more about what you would do if it's very severe and you wanted to report it to the authorities. I'm aware of terroristic threatening, but I'm not that in the weeds of the laws. So, but there are ways to report it. And so don't feel like it's something you have to do and take care of and address all by yourself.
And I concur. That's the exact same advice I've given for years when I go to high schools and I speak to high schools, exactly like that. Another little tip I might throw out there is this idea of, you don't have to have everyone on your social media page. I know having friends follow you is a form of social status and clout and social capital, but they're not Pokemon, right? You don't have to collect them all, right? You don't have to collect every single one that's out there in order to kind of build up your Pokemon trainer environment. You don't need to do that, but in order to kind of get the kind of potency and the traction that you want online. But I totally agree with Matt, exactly that. And if things certainly do get out of hand, especially when we're dealing with a younger person, and things start, they don't know who they're talking to, or they someone on the opposite end starts asking for nudes, like nude pics, right? Authorities are standing at the ready to assist in that. So something as easy as calling the local police department, the police department near you, your local FBI office. Yeah, they will help you out and steer you in the right direction.
That's so good to know. And especially for new parents, because everything's changing. So if you're a parent, look at the social media tools that your kids are using and look up the privacy settings that are most recommended.
Right.
And know that you can call local law enforcement. Like, it's not something they're going to laugh at. They will take it seriously.
Right.
I had someone send me a nude yesterday and I was like,
I'm sorry.
I didn't know who this person was. It was like someone in India, but and I didn't look at it. I like immediately kind of was like, ew, gross, and closed it. And I mean, is that a crime?
If it is of a juvenile, it is. Adults, not so much. And even with the juvenile statutes, each state is slightly different in what they consider to be juvenile and not juvenile, and who the recipient is, right? So it could vary. What could be that's right. What could be a sex crime in Kansas could very well, or what would not be a sex crime in Kansas could be a sex crime in California or in Honolulu. Understanding who's receiving and who's getting it, it's a lot more nuanced than just sending a nude pic.
But Malika, I have to tell you, as your old friend, like, that sucks and you didn't deserve that. And that has happened to me too. And I actually just was talking about this crap, for lack of a better word, to a friend of mine who studies sexual harassment. And I was like, I was so embarrassed when I received a picture like that, because then I feel like, I have to disclose to my partner, this thing happened. It's weird. It's such a weird thing. And so, not that we're going to dive all into this, but like, it makes sense to like be uncomfortable from that, to like be upset about that. I would definitely block that person. If this ever happened to a listener, and maybe it wasn't like Malika's story with someone from another country she doesn't know, but this could happen to you in a friend group or from a friend of a friend. This kind of behavior, just because you can do it, doesn't mean that it's acceptable. It doesn't mean that it's legal, depending on what state you're in. And you can take it very seriously, and you shouldn't feel like it's your fault. I just want to say that.
Thank you so much. I have another question now that's popped into my head. So, oh no, it just disappeared. Dang it, mommy brain. I was just thinking, well, it shouldn't be all about you. And then it disappeared. Oh gosh, what was it? Oh no. Okay. We'll just move on.
It'll come back.
Oh yes, it did. Okay. So I have trouble with blocking certain types of people. So for example, there's a person online that is just very vocal about the things that she believes in, and for some reason, you know, let's just say there's conflict there, and it feels like cyberbullying to me because things that I've posted have been reposted. I do not feel like I can block this person because I feel like that action would lead to more of those types of actions. So, is there anything in the research right now about those kind of nuances where, like, you shouldn't block someone because it could escalate?
Nothing comes to mind immediately, but just from like everyday managing your social media experience advice is like, you don't have to have your notifications on for everything. Like you could ignore people. I forget if that's the correct term from Instagram, but like you can filter them out without blocking them in a way that they'll never know that you're not even seeing the stuff that they're posting, right? And this happens in families where there's like different uh,
Viewpoints, yeah, political
yeah,
viewpoints,
viewpoints. Thank you.
whatever. Yeah.
I don't know why I didn't mean
Yeah,
to say it.
I've muted that person,
Yeah,
which is the term for Instagram because it did occur on Instagram. So I muted the person instead of blocking. So that was the strategy that I
yeah.
took when it came to that, and I don't engage.
I can't think of like a specific evidence-based study to tell you about. I'm sorry, my nerdy hat has tipped to the side.
No
But
worries.
but I mean, I just think in practicality, like you have to do that sometimes. And even for me, managing my own interfacing with my phone, you know, thinking about how we communicate, like, and hold conversations and keep gaze. Like, I've turned off the notifications on my phone for Facebook because it's just so crazy. And then my Instagram is like my real friends, right? So if it's on my Instagram, I kind of want to know. But if it's on my Facebook, like, I get to choose when I'm going to interface with that. And so anything that gives you more control, because I do see your point of not blocking someone who hasn't necessarily bullied you, but their content is triggering in some way. I don't know. Am I onto something, Arnold, or have I deviated from what we
No,
should?
I think you're absolutely there, and I think one of the pieces of advice I've given folks is, especially if you're a public figure, right? If people see you online rather often, whether if it's you're a political figure or in the media or something along those lines, a sports star, setting up layers of social media presence, right, is something that kind of is very helpful. And Matt hinted at that, right? That you have a personal page that you only let your intimate circle with. Those are the ones that you care about, that you're going to have notifications on. And then you have your professional public pages, right? And those are the ones that are on the outside. And guess what? There will be drama because everybody on these things is a public figure, right?
Oh, yeah,
There
yeah.
will be drama that's there. And understanding and how to cope with that should be part of the education. You know, that you're going to, we can't live in a bubble. And one of the benefits of living in a free society is that we can have these communications and people can say what they want, and they can be out there and even spew hate. So long as it doesn't cause harm to somebody else, you can go ahead and spew whatever idea you want out there. And living in an environment where we celebrate that idea and understand what that is, and then using that concept, right, as a way of socially, I guess, is a form of, I don't know, cognitive therapy, where you can socially distance yourself and say, hey, look, I'm just going to let you go ahead, do your thing. We live in the free world. Have your piece. Go ahead, say it, and just leave it out there. And then, you know, look at it as if through a microscope, examining a specimen and saying, oh, that's like a really hateful person. And then just kind of moving on, right? And just leaving that specimen there, but developing these layers, these shields, these walls, cognitively might be kind of helpful. It's something that I've always kind of recommended, and it can take shape online as well. Your personal
on the
page,
receiver's side.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
The receiver has some amount of control as well.
Right.
So that's always
Right.
good to point out. It's interesting that you both mentioned the word drama, because that came up in some of the research I was reading.
Yep.
So Marwick and Boyd in 2014,
Yes.
they said that tweens and teens use the term drama to capture that range of behaviors that can lead to
Absolutely.
harm. So cyberbullying behaviors. So as far as parents go, if you're wondering, any of you listeners, like, how do I know if my child is being cyberbullied? That could be a clue. If your child is saying, oh my gosh, there's so much drama, ask more questions, right? And then of teens on social media, 68% have experienced drama among their friends on social media. And that came from Lenhart in 2015. So it's out there, and that could just be a little clue. My kids are still too young, but once they get into that, what is it, 6th to 8th grade, Matt? I'm scared.
I know, delay it as much as you can. I mean, you'll get a lot of pushback. I'm still surprised how soon kids get cell phones, and I don't have children, so it's like I'm outside looking in, but it's a tough, changing, dynamic place out there.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Savage, Dr. La'anui, Matt and Arnold, for your time.
This was fun.
Oh my gosh.
And
well,
thank you so much for the invite.
You're just doing the coolest stuff, and it's so fun to be a part of it. So thanks for involving us.
I'm so happy to have you on. And before you go, if you can give me some recommendations for either like a book or a person or a podcast or something that, you know, just ignites your brain. Who do you listen to? Who do you learn from?
Oh my gosh, you go first.
There's a couple of folks that kind of come to mind. Back in the day, like maybe about 10 years ago, I shared the stage with a wonderful young lady by the name of Dr. Dorothy Espelage, or Espelage. She used to be at Indiana University working on bullying. Now she speaks a lot on cyberbullying. And she and I had shared a panel once. She's still a rock star, somebody I would follow, just Googling her name. I think she's at the University of North Carolina now, at Chapel Hill. She's a great person. One of my favorite books probably to read on the topic is it's a little dated, but it's still on point. It's a book called Future Reputation by Daniel Solov. It speaks a lot about online reputation and online reputation management. Just as the internet was taking off, the tenets and philosophies there still hold true to this day. It's still seminal research and discussion in that area. So I'd recommend both those resources.
I really have I'm going to check those out myself because I need more recommendations. I know that I love anything by Malcolm Gladwell. I just think he's like the best writer, and Revisionist History is his podcast that I'll like tune into. There's one called The Academic Minute or something like that like does a really good job of translating all this complexity and nuance into things that just make a lot more sense on their face. And so that's a cool thing I've gone to in the past, but I'm going to go to your recommendations, and then I'll have something to do for my last 3 weeks of a little bit of calm before the fall semester storm.
I love it. And, you know, I just got off a Zoom call with Dr. Timothy Levine, who Malcolm Gladwell's, one of his books was based on his research. So that's so awesome.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's so cool. Which one? Tipping Point or?
No, it was a different one.
I know he has
Outliers.
Hold on. It's this one, Talking to Strangers.
Oh yeah, it's the new one.
That one.
Yeah, it's one of the newer ones.
That's
well,
cool.
that's it, guys. I'm so sorry. We got all the way up to the end of your 1 hour.
No worries.
But thank you so much. Oh, this was amazing. I can't wait for people to listen in on this. And of course, as usual, all the resources and things, if you guys heard something in this podcast, will be in the show notes. So go and check them out. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Awesome. You're the best, Malika.
Aloha.
Beautification of communication, the Communification Podcast.